But I'm really pleased to say that we managed to get a really interesting and useful guest for this film club discussion. Øivind, now I got the pronunciation of your first name while we were getting ready. Is it Kopperud? Is that how you say your surname?
Yeah, it's Kopperud, yes.
Kopperud. Oh, that was easy. Okay.
And
Øivind is a historian from the Norwegian Centre for Holocaust and Minority Studies, and critically for the discussion about Betrayed, he was a historical advisor for the making of the film. So he can tell us a lot about what the filmmakers got right, what they might have had to sort of take some artistic liberties on, and just about the context, the historical context in which this film is set. And I thought, Øivind, the first question I would ask, I mean, I suppose in the UK, we're not that familiar with the Norwegian specific story, wartime experience. But maybe it would be useful for you to give us a bit of an overview of the historical context of Norway's Quisling regime against which this story is told.
Yeah, I can do that. Thank you for inviting me. First, I would like to say thank you very much. It's a pleasure. I'll try to answer your questions as good as I can, and also give some kind of introduction actually to the topic that Alex just mentioned. Norway was, I would take this into a Norwegian Jewish context as well, because of the audience, and also because my specific field of research is the history of anti-Semitism and Holocaust in Norway. And you can't actually you had to have knowledge about anti-Semitism in Norway to understand Norwegian Holocaust as well. In Norway, Norway was occupied 9th of April, 1940. In that time period in Norwegian politics, there had been an increasing anti-Semitic environment in every party, actually, not just Quisling's party that I will say something more to you about later, but every party had more or less they haven't in Norway. The problem in Norway is that we didn't have any Dreyfus affair. We didn't have some sort of incident that actually triggered a discussion about anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism more or less a part of the broader part of society, but more this cultural-based anti-Semitism, if you know what I mean. So when Norway was occupied by the Germans, the 9th of April 1940, Quisling actually took power himself. The government fled, and it's a very interesting discussion because we know that Adolf Hitler was not a very big fan of Quisling. He saw Quisling as some sort of opportunist that actually would grab power himself. And this, during the 5 years Norway was occupied, the discussion or the struggle between Hitler and Quisling was always imminent, actually. But just a few months after the 9th of April 1940, the legislation towards the Jews started also in Norway. It started with that they couldn't have any radio, you couldn't listen to radio. They were the police went to every Jewish home and took away their radios, and that was just for the Jews, not for any other group in Norway. But for the first couple of years in Norway, also as you have seen in the movie, somehow the Braudes also managed to live some sort of normal life in occupied Norway. But in 1942, it was an increase in how the Jews was treated. And from February, March 1942 until November 1942, the whole thing changed in Norway. It was impossible to live as a Jew. And the first thing we can see in Norway as a researchers is that the newspapers, and specifically the Nazi newspapers, they stopped using Jewish names. They call everybody Sarah and Israel. And so we started somehow by making a distance towards the individual by calling everybody the same thing, or at least a lot of them. And we can see an increase in how the Jews was treated during the summer 1942. And in October 1942, every Jewish man in Norway was arrested and put into a camp called Berg. 1 month later, they arrested all the children and the women. And the biggest deportation out of Norway was on the 26th of November 1942, when 526 Norwegian Jews was deported to Auschwitz. And there have also been a question, and it was also regarding in Quisling's trial after the war. It was a discussion how anti-Semitic he was or not. He said that I didn't know anything. This was something I didn't know anything about. So it was actually a discussion during the trial, but we know beyond any doubt that Quisling became more and more anti-Semitic during the war. And he was actually held, when he had speeches, the worst speeches we have in Norway is actually from Quisling. It's not from the German officials, it's actually from Quisling himself. And he talks about deportation, he talked about this conspiracy theory about Jews running the world and everything you probably know about the whole lot. And he went into some sort of when the war, he probably understood the last couple of years from 42, 43, 44, that the war, especially in 43 and 44, that the war wasn't going too well, actually. And then he also started to blame the Jews more and more, every speech he held. But still in Norway, and it's not too many weeks ago, actually, I met one of Quisling followers. There were actually a lot of, in Norway, members of Nasjonal Samling, Norwegian brand of the Nazi party. And still there is this understanding that Quisling wasn't very anti-Semitic, that he still fought for Norway. He didn't have anything against Jews. And that's kind of ridiculous if you look into the research material. So I think that the problem is that after the war, the people that, and it was in Norway, 100,000 members of the Nazi party, somehow, for many of them, the Holocaust, the deportation of the Norwegian Jews, that is something that didn't fit into the puzzle, if you know what I mean. Mm. So they said that they start to explain and say this was just the Germans, and this was not the Quisling's party, and it was, and I can say something more about that later when we're talking about the movie, because that was also a discussion during the movie. How much are you going to how much are you going to portray Norwegian bureaucracy that was heavily involved? Every aspect of the bureaucracy, Norwegian police. We know for sure that almost every Jew that was arrested in Norway was arrested by Norwegian police. And Norwegian cab drivers went along and picked them up during the night. And we know also that the Germans, Nazis, said that we didn't have to put any troops, because they did that during the teachers, they did that during other groups as well. But when they said that when it comes to the Jews, the police and the bureaucracy are more than happy to oblige.
Oh, sorry,
yeah.
go on. Sorry,
no. So that is, and that is still a discussion in Norway, and that is a part of Norwegian history that still hurts. Yes.
It's fascinating to hear what you're describing in Norway. I mean, it's so that sort of that narrative reminds me so much more of things that we're familiar with in, say, Hungary or Lithuania. You know, this idea, it's like, well, we weren't anti-Jewish, we were pro, you know, our own country, whatever it is. But to hear that it's a very similar sort of narrative in or was in Norway was interesting, and that same sort of historical revisionism continues today, much as it does in other countries. It's not unique, I suppose.
No, but it's actually quite interesting because it still does actually. This spring we had very much debate. It was a series about Norwegian frontkjempere. Frontkjempere is the guys that fought for the Germans, volunteered in Norway to fight for the Germans on the Eastern Front.
Now, sorry, go on.
Yes, and this spring, NRK, Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, had a documentary about them. It was 8 episodes, or 4 or 5 episodes, and they were portrayed as freedom fighters. They were not hating any Jews. They were just fighting against communism. And we, as researchers, we were looking at this, and I knew 3 or 4 of those people, and I knew that they was extremely anti-Semitic during the late 30s and also during the Second World War. But now they were presenting at "We fought for Norway" was the slogan.
Your colleague, Benjamin, who is the person who introduced us, when I emailed him about this film, he said, "Oh, actually, it's interesting that you're emailing about the film, because it was actually the book that preceded the film, I guess, that was even more controversial." So I'm curious, did the book or this film, you know, so I'm connecting this topic that you're talking about just sort of historical memory and revisionism, and then segueing into the film itself. Did this film add to the cultural conversation about, I mean, was it a real touch point, or was the book that preceded it a real touch point on this topic?
The book that preceded it was, to say it at least, it was some sort of a turning point in the Norwegian debate, actually. Because Marte Michelet in Norway, when they're presenting Jews during the Second World War, every Jewish person was religious, very much so. And the story that was told, what she did was that she took a Norwegian communist family, because all the children actually became communists, Charles Braude very much so, and presented another part of Jewish life in Norway. And so people started to think, and that was the same time that we had a discussion in Norway about the communist resistance. And many Jews also participated in Norwegian communist resistance, and they haven't been put out. What they did during the Second World War haven't been talked about. So there were many debates that actually some sort of crashed in a way, but or collided. But a very interesting thing with the first book of Marte Michelet, and it sold 70,000 here in Norway, and that is very, very many copies of a book here in Norway. Probably not in the UK, but in Norway it's very much. And it was a big debate about how Marte Michelet somehow not just presented the Jewish community, but how she also portrayed the bureaucracy, the taxi drivers. She also mentioned names in the book. That is something that wasn't have been done before. Every researcher had been very cautious about saying who was a cab driver, but Marte Michelet just names every cab driver and every police officer that participated in this. And we also had a debate about, and that was probably the most difficult thing, because Marte Michelet also somehow, she doesn't write it, but she also writes a little bit about, and that is not in the movie, about somehow a collaboration with the Mosaic community in Norway. That she more or less says that some of the leaders of the Mosaic community in Norway gave lists with names to the Germans so they can actually somehow get off the hook for themselves.
Thank you for that. In your response to the first question, you talked about how Norway didn't have a Dreyfus affair or something like that, and I'm curious to know about just sort of the status of the Jewish community in Norway more broadly, and the extent to which the Broda family depicted in this film was representative of it. I thought they were. I mean, I don't know, and maybe you could talk as a historical advisor to the film as well about the choice of that particular family to center the story around. But it was very interesting that you have immigrant parents from Lithuania who certainly are still, religiously observant to an extent. Their children much less so, much more integrated into mainstream Norwegian society. I mean, in sort of the first half of the 20th century in Norway, was that sort of assimilated Jewish, hybrid Norwegian Jewish identity quite typical, or was that maybe an exception to the norm? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think that it depends on who you ask, actually.
Okay.
From my perspective, I think the story about acculturation, in a way, that they actually adapt to Norwegian culture, but still they're actually keeping hold of their Jewish roots. That is more or less that's very typical for because a lot of Norwegian. I have to explain a little bit about how the Jews came to Norway, actually, because in 1814 Norway had a new constitution and Jews was banned from coming to Norway. That was lifted in 1851, but still there were just 10-20 people coming to Norway. But during the pogroms in the east in the 1880s, a couple of hundreds came, and a lot more came during the First World War. So in Norway, we don't have a long history of our Jewish history in Norway is not that long. So Charles Braude was second generation. And that's quite typical with second generation. I think not just regarding the Jews, but also other groups, that they also more adapt to the community that they are living in. And I think that's quite typical. What is not quite typical with the Braude family was that they were, as I said, they were communists. Charles Braude was a communist, and there were not too many Jews in Norway that was communists at that time, at least. There were some 20, 30, but that is not very typical. But Martin Michelet was a leader of a Norwegian political party, youth leader of a Norwegian political party called Red, and that is closely to Marxist-Leninists, actually. And that's why she chose the Braude family. She wanted to, that was something she did on purpose, just to show that Jews that lived in Norway was, not everybody of them went to the synagogue on a Saturday. Jewish life is, people live their life differently, and she wanted to show that. So when they, when we talked about that regarding the movie, it was kind of difficult to change the family, because she had done all this research about it, and also the director wanted to have this family because Charles Braude was a very good Norwegian boxer. And that was something that actually many of the Jews that came to Norway, especially young men, they actually became some of Norway's most famous boxers. I don't know exactly why, but we have Otto von Porat. It was lots of Norwegian Jews that actually became quite famous, actually, to as boxers, also later on as skiers. But she chose that family with a purpose, obviously.
It must, I mean, it must always be hard, whether you're an author, filmmaker, or whatever, to find the perfect, if you want to center it around a real life story, which to the credit of the filmmakers, they did. Which which boxes do you need to tick to get the representative family? And I don't know if they stumbled onto the Broda family or if it was a search for one just like that. But it was quite interesting that it is representative of a lot of different sort of elements of the 20th century Jewish experience, broadly defined, in a lot of different ways. Anyway, I want to just make sure to say to our audience, if you have questions, I'm going to scan across. Do raise your hand if you wanted to ask a question on camera, or if you want to type it into the chat box. We can do that as well. I see one from Jenny Evans here, who says, "How is the film received by the public?" We sort of touched on the book earlier. I mean, you mentioned when we were just getting ready for the call that it just won sort of some of the Norwegian equivalent of the BAFTAs. Do you want to talk a little bit about the public response?
The public response was overwhelming, actually. As I said to Alex, it couldn't come at a more bad time, actually, because of the corona and COVID and everything. So people couldn't go to the cinema to watch the movie. And that was a big blow, of course. In Norway, we have, economically, it went quite well because we have different arrangements in Norway that subsidize the movies that don't come to the cinemas. So, but I think that it was very well received. Of course, it's always a mixture, but in Norway, I think that for the first time in Norwegian history, they made a movie about Norwegian Holocaust with the most prominent Norwegian actors. And that was something in itself that was kind of spectacular, because there have been movies before, but movies have been, I'm not there to criticize, but they haven't put too much money and consideration into all of those films. It's more, this was a broad Norwegian, some sort of a big movie in Norwegian terms. They received a lot of money of funding to actually make this. So it was, and as I said, the most prominent Norwegian actors played in that movie. They wanted to play in that movie, and that is.
I'm curious, just from your perspective as a historian, did that influence your decision to be involved? Because I could imagine you could be a little bit conflicted, if you are a serious historian, and hearing that. I always say Hollywood, all right? So it's not Hollywood; it's whatever Norway's version of Hollywood is going to represent the Holocaust on screen. There's so many pitfalls. There's so much that could go wrong. Was your sense that, well, this movie is going to happen with or without me, so I better get involved to try and make it as good as possible?
Yeah, that was actually one of the reasons, because I think the book was also quite good. I really love the book, and I think if you're going to turn this into a movie, it's very important that this is not going to be a debate about historical the historical facts. You have to do that seriously.
Yeah.
Because then the movie can be as good as whatever, but they still will be a discussion about the facts.
Right.
And I think that I can say that I actually had two main, when I watched the movie the first time, I said, okay, I have two. One thing was that actually the last scene in the movie. For me, a Holocaust is about the lowest point in European civilization ever. And they had a discussion about showing all these bodies. And I said, no, the people that have been murdered, they have also lived. They have their own life. They have respect. We have to also show them respect when they are dead. So when they're running into the night, I think that was, everybody knows what are happening. Everybody. You don't need an explanation. So and they listened to me and another historian that actually said that. So thankfully.
I'm very glad you said that. Because I noticed that particular choice that they seem to have made, and I was glad that they did that. You don't, no one living could possibly know what it was like in a gas chamber,
exactly.
And so why try to pretend?
No, exactly. Exactly.
Wait, and did you say that there was another thing that
Yeah, it was also the discussion about, we talked before we started a little bit about that. The first edition of the movie I saw, it was they didn't have any Germans. The Germans was not there in the movie. And it's very important when you talk about the Norwegian participation, both people involved in the Nazi movement and just ordinary bureaucracy and bureaucracy. We also have to show that Norway was occupied, and the Holocaust was a European project. If you watch that movie the first time and you didn't have any pre-knowledge, you can probably have thought that, okay, this happened just in Norway.
Right.
So that was very important to put this in this broader European context, that the Holocaust in Norway is a part of the European Holocaust. And if you can't show that, it's meaningless.
I thought they did generally a good job. I mean, there was a lot about the film that I thought was, in some ways, it followed I don't mean to be dismissive of it, but like a sort of formula of Holocaust films. But at least for us in the UK, we haven't seen the Norwegian story depicted very much, if at all. And so it was kind of okay if it followed some of the same tropes or formulas that other films have followed, because it told us a new story. And so in learning about the Norwegian story, I thought it was quite good that it's, it had a very distinct Norwegian, there was something about what happened there that was not the exact same as what happened in other places. But of course, as you very rightly point out, you can't separate it from the broader European project that was the Holocaust. So I thought I felt like they struck that balance pretty well. We have loads of questions coming in.
Do
sorry,
you
go on.
ask, shall I read the questions, or
no? I'm
questions?
happy to relay them to you.
Okay.
You don't have to. That otherwise I'll be out of a job here. So
okay.
Justin writes, the boxing scene in the detention camp with Broder versus the commandant was very painful to watch. I agree. But how true could it have been? This gets to your point about, historical accuracy and liberties. Could a Jewish prisoner have survived his victory? Do you know anything about that?
I think it's a very good question, actually. I think it was actually the people, the soldiers working in Berg, the prison camp. They were Norwegian frontkjempere that has fought on the Eastern Front and came back. So they were somehow brutalized, but there wasn't many people that was actually killed in these camps. So somehow, I think that I thought about it myself, and I think especially he could probably have survived the first scene where he was kicked into the pigs just to humiliate him. I didn't think he will actually have survived the last fight, because nobody was there, and the officer was humiliated.
Right.
So he will probably have been killed. So I think that is artistic liberty, actually.
Okay. That sounds about right, but it's one of these things where you sort of feel like if that's the level of artistic liberty, I don't know, I guess I could kind of live with that one, because in the end, it's like it doesn't really affect.
No, exactly, and that is the problem with. I could just say another thing as well, because as I said to Alex, I work closely with the actor that portrayed Knut Rød, the police officer that was responsible for the deportation. It was Karl Martinsen, leader of the Statspolitiet. He just gave the orders, but Knut Rød was the man sitting in the office for long hours, sorting the lists and everything. And as I said to Alex, he helped the resistance during the war. We know that he wasn't ideologically motivated. He wasn't any anti-Semite. It's down to discussion as well, but we can't find any traits during the war or before the war that he wrote anything, said anything, but still he did the job, and he was very proud of doing the job. And that is another thing that was a problem, because the historical evidence from this time period is very problematic. And I can tell you about one scene. I don't know if you remember it, but there's a woman, Amalie Laksov, knocking on Knut Rød's door. And she's saying, I heard that there is something happening to us Jews. Is this true? And he is going to pretend to take a telephone. Yeah. That was very difficult. And that was probably the scene that they worked with the most, because there are two answers to that question from the same woman. The woman herself has said that he didn't help me at all, but she also said on another occasion, also in written, that he closed the door and then opened the door again and said, if I were you, Fru Laksov, I would have fled to Sweden.
Okay.
So it's very difficult, actually. And how are you going to take a scene like that? You don't know what is actually what have happened. We can't ask Amalie Laksov. She died several years ago. It's very difficult to understand, to know how. And what they did was that they filmed the scene, and then she's fleeing with her child the moment after. And then it's up to the audience to somehow think, okay, did he say anything, or did he, did he say that she could flee to Sweden, or was it just saying that nothing at all, actually? So yeah, sorry.
No, it's fascinating. Thank you. Jackie and Stephen asked the question, what was the role of the established church towards the Jews? That might be a very big question.
A very interesting question, because that is my main topic, actually, the Norwegian Church and
Brilliant.
Second World War. So I'm going to the historian days in Norway, in Tromsø, 3 days ago, and talk about just that. So yes, in Norway, the church was living along the Nazi government for a couple of years. But in 1942, in what is Norwegian called Statsakten, when Quisling is not just the leader, he's pointing himself out to be Minister President. It's the struggle with the church starts. And he starts to intervene, and he wants to point out bishops, and he wants to point out priests. And then all the bishops say, we can't work with you, sorry, we can't work with this government. So they wrote a statement called Kirkens Grunn, that they say we don't want to have anything to do with the Nazi party, along with 93% of all the priests in Norway. And they talk about the school children, and how Quisling tried to indoctrinate them. But there isn't any word about the Jews. But as I said, during the summer and the autumn 1942, there are increase in anti-Jewish legislation, also violence towards the Jews. And in October, November 1942, the bishops that have now stepped down, as I said, because they don't want to have anything to do with the Quisling regime, they write a letter that is very much discussed in Norway, called the Hebrew letter. And that is a letter to Vidkun Quisling, where they're actually writing that you're going straight to hell when you act like this towards the Jews. And many have said that this is a very brave letter, and it is. It don't take many things into consideration. But at the same time, they're writing this to Quisling and not the Nazi leader Terboven. Because they know that if they have written this letter to Terboven, the leader of the German forces in Norway, they will all have been sentenced to death.
Right.
But Quisling at that time wasn't very popular. So to write this kind of letter to Quisling, they didn't take too much of a chance, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. David writes, do we know whether the small number of Jews that survived the war told their story and whether they remained in Norway, or did they emigrate, say, to Israel or other places?
It was actually a lot. It was approximately 2,100 Jews living in Norway on the outbreak of Second World War. And approximately 1/3 was killed in Auschwitz. Some of them managed to hide in Norway. But more than 1,000 actually managed to flee to Sweden. And some of them actually stayed in Sweden after the war. But there wasn't too many that actually went to Israel, emigrated to Israel from Norway. That was very few, actually.
Thank you. Vivian writes, do you know if the film has been shown in other Scandinavian countries? If so, how is it received? She writes, I lived in Denmark for many years, where there is, of course, a very different Jewish story, one of rescue to Sweden. I'd never heard of the anti-Semitism in Norway. How is it possible to cover this up for nearly 80 years?
I think that the problem with anti-Semitism is that somehow after the war, anti-Semitism was synonymous with Adolf Hitler.
Right.
So every politician that actually been quite outspoken anti-Semitic during the 30s, somehow it was forgotten because Adolf Hitler had done far worse, if you know what I mean. So it was just forgotten, and it's just a few years ago actually that you started to put this as a field of research. Look into this. We have a couple of 3 or 4 or 5 PhDs, some of them finished, some of them close to be finished, that look very deep into this actually. And they have found that Norway was quite anti-Semitic compared to the other Scandinavian countries as well. But our own explanation, and that is the problem, because this has to do with our own history. And I think every country actually, that is not very typical of Norway, but a lot of countries actually find it hard to talk about the country's own anti-Semitism. It's very difficult. It's more easier to talk about how we was occupied for 5 years and talk about the Nazi collaborators. But we know for a fact that, of course, the Nazi collaborators was anti-Semitic as well. But that there was a lot of the people working in the resistance in Norway that actually was anti-Semitic as well. They didn't fought for the Jews. And Martin Michelet, in her last book, she also said that they didn't want to help the Jews, and that sparked a debate that was extremely intense. She said that the resistance actually sold out the Jews. Yes.
So they were pro-Norway, not pro-Jews.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And they didn't look at the Jews living in Norway, also Norwegian Jews with Norwegian citizenship, as Norwegians. And that is a big part of the problem.
It's interesting because then you have, people on both sides who claim to be acting in the interests of Norway, suppose.
Exactly. And also Vidkun Quisling claimed that. He said that he fought for Norway. Everybody fought for Norway in a way. And it was actually a book that was that came out 10, 12 years ago that said the title of the book was "We Fought for Norway," and it was interviews with both Nazis and resistance fighters.
Excellent, thank you. Cheryl asked a very important question, which I think touches on, the legacy of a lot of what we're describing here, which is, has this been discussed and taught in schools? Do you know to what extent? I'm assuming your organization, which is how I came to know you in the first place, does a lot of educational work, but what extent is the Holocaust generally and this specific sort of more controversial national story taught in schools?
To the last decade, actually, it's been much better. Before that, it wasn't any actually talk about this in the schools. And if you look at the curriculum in Norwegian schools, they talked about the Second World War. And one book actually was quite interesting. One book about the Second World War, about everybody that fled during the Second World War. With 600 pages, have one sentence about the Jews, and that was also the Jews fled to Sweden. So that says something as well. So this was not the topic in the schools, but it's been much better in the last couple of years. Now at least they're telling the story about the deportation of the Norwegian Jews. But the problem is that there still is how you tell this story. And we try in our organization to have this, we was occupied by the Nazi Germans, but at the same time, Norwegian bureaucracy that have helped people in the 30s and helped people in the 50s, during the 40s, they helped the Germans to deport Norwegian Jews. And that is also a part of Norwegian history. And that sparked, of course, a lot of debate, and people said they were forced to, they had to do this, if you know what I mean. So, but it's been better, but it can still be much better yet.
And am I correct in saying, do you work at is it a museum? Is there
I am a researcher and special advisor and a deputy to the director in our institution, but so I'm a researcher myself. But we also have an educational department. Benjamin is heading that department.
Right.
We also have the projects, Dembra. I know you are familiar with Peder Nustad as well.
Yeah.
So we have most of my colleagues actually somehow are working with the school children. And in Oslo, they have to come to the Holocaust Centre during when they go to school during the.
So there is an actual center that people visit. I mean,
yes.
I think I was there many years ago.
Yes, we have many thousands. Not the last 18 months, but still,
right.
We somehow managed to do this digitally. So the numbers haven't increased actually, or decreased.
Well, I mean that's great. That people are, it's not just going to the center that draws people in, that they are learning about it in whatever means is available to them at the time. Justin asked, did Sweden try to limit Jewish refugees coming in, as I gather Switzerland did at sometimes? How easy, because we see that depicted in the film, don't we, about people just saying, well, we can go to Sweden. How easy was that?
That was also a debate the last couple of years, because it's many have testified that they were okay, they could come to Sweden, but on the border they were robbed for everything they had. That's one part of the story. Another part of the story was that we know that at least in some period during the Second World War, it wasn't that easy to get to Sweden. So they couldn't just go to Sweden. But on the other hand, it's when they first came to Sweden, the Swedish population or the Swedish government tried to solve this as good as they can. But At the same time, that is down to the Swedish role during the Second World War, and they was neutral, as you probably know. On the same time, new research has shown that they wasn't neutral at all. They remained neutral because they allowed the Germans to do everything they could. Transport prisoners, Russian prisoners through Sweden. So neutrality is somehow, yeah, this is a strange term actually sometimes.
Oh, I see, Carolyn, you have your hand up.
Yes, at the end of the film, they gave a date when Norway had apologized, and I think it was it 2012? Why hadn't they apologized before, and why did they apologize then? What happened?
Great question.
Very good question. Yes, it's down to that until that time period, they had said that the Quisling regime was not a legal regime. So a Norwegian government in 2000 couldn't apologize for anything that an illegitimate regime have done. That was the main object. So, and that's why Jens Stoltenberg, when he actually apologized, it wasn't. I think they have probably used a lot of time on that statement actually, because as a researcher I can look into that and I see exactly what they have written and exactly what they could have written but chose not to write. So it's they apologized, but they apologized for how Norwegians had as so and so. But they said that we can't apologize for a regime that's not ours. It's not a part of the Norwegian democratic system. So that was the explanation they came up with. But I think it's more or less. Sorry. Of course, they can't. If the church want to apologize for something that happened 500 years ago, everybody knows that it's not the bishops of today that actually are responsible for that. And the same with the abolishment of slavery. It's the same with every historical. So I think they somehow was too afraid to apologize because they didn't want to. They want to apologize on the same time they want not to apologize.
I wonder if there's, I mean, at the end of the film where they give some of the, you know, what Carolyn was referring to, some of the sort of historical updates. Well, they talked about how the Broda family, and I'm assuming most, if not all others, had more or less everything that they owned had been either stolen or taken or sort of confiscated in a more official way. And I wonder if there is a sort of legal reason that they were trying to avoid apologizing, because then they become responsible for all of the assets and the property.
Exactly, and I think that was part of the reason. I think there was a lot of legal voices looking into that before they published it, and on the same time, our center is actually a part of the settlement in Norway, because after the war, every prisoner that had been sent to Germany received more or less the same amount of money, actually, as some sort of a damage. And the Jewish community wouldn't talk anything about it. But during the 1990s, it was a huge debate in Norway that some people said that, hold on, wait a minute, the Jews lost everything. They actually lost everything. Many of them could come back to their apartments, and when they came back to their apartments, people were living there, and sometimes they wasn't thrown out. They had to find another place to live, and they lost all their money, they lost all their everything. So people say that you can't compare a regular Norwegian prisoner going as a political prisoner to a camp in Germany, even if that was terrible as well. I'm not going to say that wasn't terrible. Compare it to victims of the Holocaust. It's two totally different things. And then it was a debate in Norway because the majority decided that it was more or less fair. It was a utvalg in Norway. We had this state. I don't know what exactly you can compare it to in the UK, but there was some sort of a it was decided that it was a broad committee with historians, lawyers, and some politicians that said that this was more or less fair. But it was a minority in that committee that said, no, this is not fair at all.
Mm.
And what happened in Norwegian, on this Norwegian political history, is that when it came to the government decided that we're going to follow up the minority. They are right about this. So it was a big settlement for, I think it was approximately 400 million Norwegian kroner, is more or less 40 million pounds, I guess. And 1/3 of that went to concrete Jewish individuals that survived the Holocaust or their families. 1/3 went to a committee that was going to try to preserve Eastern European culture, the Yiddish culture in Eastern Europe, and 1/3 was going to be given to some sort of an economic basis for a Holocaust Center, and that is us.
Mm.
But you're right. I think that when Jens Stoltenberg read that statement, there's probably been loads of lawyers in there before he did that.
Someone asked here about where was it? Oh yeah, Jackie and Stephen again said, why did the Germans take the Jews to Poland rather than deal with them in Norway? I mean, obviously this was very much the model of the final solution was the extermination camps. The purpose-built death camps were all in Poland essentially. But I am curious about the camps that are depicted in Norway. I mean, we saw I would pronounce it Berg, but I think that's wrong.
Berg is all right.
Okay. Yeah. And there are others. I remember there's a camp all the way up near Trondheim, is it there? Mm. And so how many camps were in Norway? And are they marked today? Are people aware of their existence and their wartime role?
There were a lot of camps in Norway. It was Berg that it was chosen regarding the deportation of the Norwegian Jews because it was close to Oslo, and the majority of Norwegian Jews lived in the Oslo area. But you also have Espeland in the western part, close to Bergen, and you have Falstad, close to Trondheim. But it was that was just some of the Jews living in Trondheim, they were sent to Falstad, but it was just a transit camp on the way to Auschwitz. So in Norway, the camps were, it was many people from Yugoslavia that came to Norway to work for the German war industry. There were 6 or 7 Jews, I guess, that survived staying in camps here in Norway, something like that. For different reasons, but it was decided straight away that we're going to be sent to Stettin and to Auschwitz. Yes,
there's a story about a particular Greek island where there was one Jew living, and as part of the roundups, the Nazis sent someone across to this island in Greece to take this one person off the island, deport him, take him to the mainland, deport him to Auschwitz, to have him killed. And the obvious question is why bother? First of all, why bother at all? And also, I suppose if you were that committed to killing the person, why not just kill them there? And I feel like the other literal pole of that same narrative is you've got parts of Norway that are practically the Arctic Circle, and the idea that they would track down Jews living in the remotest outposts of humanity. Just to find them, take them away from there, and then have them killed is quite a powerful statement, and something that really haunts me. And I suppose that's That's one of the reasons why it's important for us in the UK, one of the reasons, to learn about the Norwegian experience.
Yeah.
You know, that your national story matters, not just in Norway, but you know, if you really want to understand the Holocaust. Of course, we're never going to learn about, you know, every, you know, in depth about every country's national story and how it differs. But I feel like it, you know, the getting a richer picture of the totality of this, of what the Holocaust involved is so important if you're trying to get your head around it at all. So I'm really,
and I also think that for Norway, some sort of, it's very difficult actually to talk about Norwegian Holocaust as well, because you have Sweden that was neutral, you had Denmark, and as you probably know, the most of you, that the story of how it was a lot of circumstances why that happened, but how they actually managed to get every Jew over to Sweden. In Norway, we didn't have that story.
Yep.
So why? And it's somehow it's very difficult to talk about. And when I talk with colleagues that are historians but not in this field of research, they're somehow okay, can't we move on? Can't we go to talk about anything else? Because this is some kind of also humiliating for Norwegian society, and that's why we don't want to talk about it. We did, and for several decades we didn't talk about it at all. People knew that people have gone away, and I still remember I had a grandma that still talked about this Feinberg family living in Oslo that just they just disappeared without asking any questions. Why didn't they came back? So it's very difficult actually.
Well, I mean, I'm very well. First of all, thank you for the work that you're doing. I mean, if a society is embarrassed by something and they only want to, you know, commemorate about their triumphs, then they're, you know, what is the point of people like you, historians, doing this work at all if we're not learning from our lowest points in addition to our triumphs?
I totally agree.
On that note, it's ticked over to 5 o'clock now. We said that this would be an hour-long conversation, and I apologize to everyone whose questions we didn't get to. There were a lot of them. This was definitely a film that provoked a lot of fodder for thought, but also just a historical episode and a national story that I think, as I said, so many of us probably weren't very well versed in, that has now like given a lot of us here in the UK, a lot of our AJR members, and a lot to think about, and I've personally learned a lot. I hope others, you can nod along if you agree, from the film and from Øivind's expert sort of commentary on it. So you got a few thumbs up there, a few applauses.
Thanks.
There you go. Thank you everyone for joining us for this film club discussion. We have another film that we'll be publicizing in next week's email newsletter for next month. I hope you will join us again for our discussion of that one. We'll have films in September and October, and we're going to take November off of the film club because that's when the UK Jewish Film Festival is. So we don't need to do it. There'll be enough then. But watch this space for more details about our next month's film. Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Øivind, for joining us. This has been really great. Okay.
It's been a pleasure. Bye.
Bye. See you all.